Okay. So I don't have anyone in the waiting room right now, so I think that we probably got about everyone here. There'll be some others coming in. As normal, guys, I'm going to be taking attendance during this, so if I'm looking down or not paying attention, I'm taking notes. Make sure that your name is showing up. I think I have everyone's name. There's one phone number I don't recognize, but I'll look that up. We're really excited about today's training and what Marco's going to share. But before we get into that, I'm going to let you know that our next Casa Cafe or Lunch and Learn is going to be about health passport and about medical advocacy for our kids. So health passport, even Marco is going to be familiar with health passport, but it's a huge tool for us to be able to really advocate for our child's medical needs and to know for sure what medicines they're on, what treatment's been done in the past, where they are. You get to see the child's entire medical history in health passport. So we're going to do a training on that. It will be Casey Robles that will be doing that. She'll be back with us again. And I'm not sure the exact date on it. It'll be in the next week or two, and I'll be emailing you guys details about that. You also know that I always do door prizes at the end, so stay on to the very end if you can, so that you can be eligible to win one of the door prizes. So if you read your bio that I emailed out, you know that Marco has an extensive history with the department. He began as a conservatorship worker in Travis County. Then he became a conservatorship supervisor after that. He worked in family-based services, FBSS, and then he was an investigative supervisor with the department as well. So he has a wide range of experience before he even landed in the family drug section, the unit. So he has a lot of experience with families that deal with addiction and substance abuse. And he is going to have a lot of great information to share with us today. So as you think about your questions, make sure that you put them in the chat box. If you're worried that you're going to forget, put it in the chat box, and then we'll make sure that we get that. At the end of this, I will have this recording on our private YouTube channel so that if you want to go back and review something again, you'll be able to go. And if someone, of course, is not able to join us today, I'll send that out to them so that everybody can take advantage of Marco's great wealth of knowledge. So Marco, thank you for coming. We first heard about Marco at Champion for Children. He spoke there this year, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
So we appreciate him. He was going to be traveling back to Abilene to do this live with us until COVID happened. So thanks for your flexibility. And guys, just make sure you give Marco your full attention and make sure you're on mute. And if you have any questions, put them in that chat box. Marco, it's yours. I'm going to let you take control of the screen.
Awesome. So hopefully, are you guys able to see my screen?
No. Not yet. Did
Okay.
you do share and then you have to do advanced and select which one you want?
Okay. Share. Screen. There we go. Okay.
There you go.
All right. So let me. Okay. Awesome. Well, so you guys can see the screen now?
Yes, we can. Yes.
Perfect. Well, thank you guys so much for inviting me back to speak with you guys. What I'm going to talk to you guys today about specifically is drug testing. I like to have these conversations with CASA just so that everybody's on the same page when we're talking about drug testing. I feel like it's really important that CASA and really all the advocates, I like to do this training for attorneys, and whether it's our own attorneys or the attorney ad litems. But I think it's really important for everybody to have a shared understanding of what drug testing capabilities we actually have. I think sometimes we make the mistake of going into court or going to a family team meeting or a family group conference or whatever it may be, and having these conversations about a drug test that you may want, or something that you've heard, or something that a peer has told you, or something that you've seen on TV, or whatever it may be. And it may not be consistent with what we have access to. So I like to have these type of conversations just so that everybody has a shared understanding of what we actually have access to in the child welfare system, how we use them, what the limitations are, kind of what they mean and what they don't mean, so that we all are starting from the same level of understanding. As Rebel mentioned, I've been with the agency for a long time. I personally am very passionate about families and substance use. I myself am the child of someone who was a recovering addict, and so I don't know what it's like to be an addict, because that's not my perspective, but I certainly have the perspective of the children that we work with, because I grew up like many of them, and I was fortunate enough to see my dad have several years of sobriety before he passed away. So I got to see both sides of it. And so that's something certainly that I want for the families that we work with. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Again, this is a much longer presentation, so I'm only going to focus on the drug testing questions or slides. So we have in our agency really when we think about it, we have really three basic types of drug tests that are available to us. And I'm sure you guys are all familiar with them. We have oral swab drug testing, and that can come in two different forms. It can be a lab confirmed drug test, which means it's sent off and independently verified, or we can do what's called an instant swab, which means that the caseworker puts it in the client's mouth, and within 30 to 60 seconds, you get a result back. So that's one type of drug testing. We have urinalysis drug testing, which again, I'm sure you're all familiar with. Our caseworkers do not collect urine. Anytime we do a urine test, the client is sent to a facility. That facility collects the sample. It's sent off to an independent lab and tested. And then we have hair strand testing. And again, it's exactly how it sounds. You send a client to a collection site, the hair is collected and sent off to an independent lab, and it's tested. So those are the three basic types of drug tests, and I'll get into the differences of those tests. Additionally, you guys may, may be reading an affidavit for the first time about a case that you've just been assigned, and they may reference something like a meconium test. Meconium testing is something that's done at the hospital. CPS has we play no role in that testing. We don't request that test. We don't contract for that test. We have nothing to do with that test whatsoever. That's strictly hospital test. But basically what happens is upon the baby's birth, the first stool is collected and sent off for analysis. And so I'll explain kind of how that test happens as well. So those will be the four drug testing types. Just again, be aware that the meconium testing is not anything that we actually do ourselves. So oral swabs, again, you may hear these referred to as instant read tests. To be specific or to be technical, the instant tests are not a test at all. It's really a screen. So to differentiate, a screen is anything that's unconfirmed, and a drug test is something that's gone through secondary confirmation. So anything that's sent off and it's been verified by a medical review officer, by an MRO, that would be a full test. Anything where you just use you pee in a cup and they put a dipstick and somebody just gets the sample, or a swab and you put it in somebody's mouth and you get an instant sample, those are screening. So screening tools, I mean, they're still very good, but because they're not lab confirmed, they're generally not admissible in court. The only screens that we use are the oral swabs. Everything else that we have contracted is definitely a lab confirmed sorts. So here's some basic information about oral swabs. They have a window of detection of about 24 to 36 hours. I always tell my caseworkers that they're generally very accurate for the first 24 hours. They're usually not nearly as accurate for that 24 to 36 hours. And what I mean by that is, I don't mean that they're somehow inaccurate in the sense that you're going to get some kind of a weird false positive. I mean inaccurate in the sense that they may not pick up use. It really depends on the quality of the drug itself, the amount that the person used, you know, how much the person has drank in the interim, how much they've eaten, how much saliva they have in their mouth, et cetera, et cetera. So the quality of accuracy after that 24th hour tends to fade. But in that first 24 hours are pretty accurate. So I think we can speak with a relatively high level of confidence that if we do an oral swab and they're positive, we can speak with a certain degree of confidence that indicates use in the last 24 hours. At most, the last 36 hours. So you're still talking about a day and a half at best. So when you have when we're dealing with a parent and, you know, they say, you know, Mr. Quesada, I'm not going to lie to you. I used a week ago. Guess what? I've just been lied to. You know, and I always kind of joke with my staff, but kind of a pro tip, if you will, a big best practice guide is anytime somebody starts a sentence with, I'm not going to lie to you, you're about to be lied to, because nobody talks like that. Nobody in their normal life uses phrases like, I'm not going to lie to you. So anyhow, 24 to 36 hours, it's a 6-panel drug test. So it will detect marijuana, cocaine, amphetamines, methamphetamines, PCP, and your basic opiates. And what I mean by basic opiates I mean non-synthetic opiates. So anything that's morphine based. So things like hydrocodone, heroin, Tylenol 3, codeine. Codeine will convert to morphine. So anything like that, it will show up. It will not pick up synthetic opiates though. So it will not pick up methadone, which is synthetic opiate. It will not pick up Oxycontin, oxycodone, Dilaudid, Percocets. It won't pick up any of those things. It will not pick up benzodiazepine. So it will not pick up things like Xanax or Klonopin or things of that nature. So it is a limited drug test in the sense of what it will and will not detect. How we use these tests? Well, I would say that we use them, the instant reads, we use them really on a limited basis. Like if it's after hours on the weekend, let's say we get a call out on a weekend, kind of an on-call type situation, and the labs are going to be closed. A caseworker will typically go out with an instant read swab so that they can make some kind of preliminary assessment of the situation. And even though that's not a lab confirmed test, and maybe that's not going to be admissible in court, you still want to try to make as most informed a case decision as you can to ensure child safety. So again, something is better than nothing. And so even if it's not the best tool in the world, it's still a relatively good tool. So that's kind of how we use these instant read tests. Sometimes if we're going out in a very rural area where we have little to no access to labs, or the parents that we're working with or the family that we're working with have limited transportation or something, we might use an oral swab in that situation. I will say that counties that are very rural, they tend to have the lab confirmed oral swabs. And the difference is those are admissible in court because the caseworker doesn't get an instant result. The caseworker simply puts the swab in the person's mouth. It's put in a sealed envelope. The client signs off on it, and it's sent off and independently verified. So that's really the only difference between an instant read swab screen and an actual lab confirmed swab. The tool is basically the same. They look slightly different, but they detect the same things. They detect those 6 drugs. They go back 24 to 36 hours. One just happens to be admissible in court. One gives you an instant result. UA testing. UA is kind of our next drug testing type. It is generally considered kind of the gold standard in the industry. They're all lab confirmed. We don't use any non-lab confirmed urinalysis. So anytime we send a client for a UA, it is admissible in court. For drugs other than marijuana, they have a window of detection of about 3 to 5 days, depending on the individual. The exact detection period varies slightly person to person for a variety of reasons. You know, how much food they've consumed, their personal metabolism, how hydrated they are, how much they weigh, their gender. All of these things play a slight variable. The quality of the drug itself actually plays a role. But roughly 3 to 5 days is your window of detection. So it makes it a great tool for the child welfare type agencies, because a UA really speaks to somewhat of an immediate danger type situation. If someone is positive on a UA, then we know somewhere in the last 3 to 5 days, they've used a substance that's impaired them in some way. So if we're addressing a situation where we have received a report that a child or children were believed to have been unsafe because of a parent's substance use, and we send them for a UA and they come back and they're positive, then it's easy to connect that dot from point A to point B that yes, the allegation is in fact accurate. Here we have this proof that's lab confirmed, independently verified. It is in fact a positive for whatever drug. So it's a good tool in that sense. And again, it speaks to some certain amount of immediacy within the last 3 to 5 days. The exception would be for marijuana. Marijuana tends to stay in your system longer because marijuana, or THC in particular, binds to fat cells. And so you release marijuana through the process of fat oxidation. And so that process takes some time. It can range from as little as about 21 days all the way up to about 45 days, depending on the amount of use. So again, if you have someone who's using, let's say, once every 2 weeks, you know, they have some random occasion every couple of weeks where they meet up with a friend, and that type of very, very infrequent use may only show up in the urine for 21 days. If we're dealing with someone who's using more regular, let's say 2 to 3 times a week, maybe even 4 times a week, we would expect that type of use to be in their urine for about 30 days, or about a month, which is what I'm sure you guys are most familiar with. And I think most caseworkers kind of give you the rule of thumb that a UA will be positive for marijuana for about 30 days from the client's date of last use. There are exceptions to that. If someone is a really, really heavy marijuana user, meaning that they're using marijuana daily, multiple times a day, or really high THC content cannabis, that type of use may actually stay in their system longer than 30 days. So it's not unheard of for that type of really heavy use to be in their system for, let's say, up to 45 days. The advice that I always give my caseworkers, and I'll share this advice with you and attorneys as well, is I always encourage staff, when you're working with families who we believe to have a marijuana use problem specifically, is to ask them what their date of last use is. And that's an important date. We need to get their self-reported date of last use. And then we need to ask them how much they were using. And then with those 2 pieces of information, we should be able to create an expected date at which point you would have a negative. So as an example, if someone says, my last date of use was June 1st, the amount that I was using up to that point was anywhere between 2 and 4 times a week, depending on what was happening in my life and, you know, what I had access to, et cetera, et cetera. So on average, let's say 3 times a week, then we would expect that person to be able to produce a negative UA by July 1st, excuse me, you know, within 30 days. So again, you need that self-reported last date of use, and we need to know the amount so that we can have some expected date on when we would have a negative. If you don't have those two figures, then we're just guessing. And we don't want to be guessing. What I mean by guessing is you could potentially send someone to do a UA June 10th, and they're going to be positive. You send somebody to the UA on June 17th, they're going to be positive. June 22nd, they're going to be positive. Well, if you don't know that they would be positive until July 1st, that could be really problematic, right? You can see how it looks totally different. If you report to the court, we got involved with this family on June 1st, and then they continued to be positive on June 10th, June 17th, and June 22nd. Well, the judge hears that as this parent who's been non-compliant and has continued to disobey a court order or a DFPS request or whatever for 3 weeks. And so that client may be seen as, non-compliant, when in fact, maybe they had actually stopped using, but that substance is going to stay in their system longer. So we need to be aware of that with marijuana. And so in that example, again, there's not necessarily anything inherently wrong with testing June 10th or 17th or whatever, if you just want to document some of that. But the fact that they're positive shouldn't be necessarily alarming, or it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. We would expect them to be positive up until July 1st. Now, if you were to do a UA on July 15th and they're still positive, now we have an issue that we need to discuss. Either they were dishonest with you about their last date of use, or they were dishonest with you about their frequency of use prior to them discontinuing use. So again, that at that point we would need to have a further discussion. But I simply point that out because it's really important, especially if you guys are assigned these cases, and generally speaking, these are legal cases. And so you guys are writing a court reports and reporting to the court, just like DFPS staff are reporting to the court. And so we need to make sure that we're reporting to the court accurate information, and that we're not incorrectly painting a more negative picture than needs to be painted. I mean, we want to be as accurate and transparent as possible. Now, the flip side of that is, if we're talking about drugs other than marijuana, then that should never be the case, right? Because those drugs are in and out of your system in 3 to 5 days. So in that same example, if someone says, I last used cocaine on January 1st, and then we do a UA on June 1st, and we do a UA on June 7th, it should be negative, regardless of how much cocaine they used. It doesn't matter the amount, just 7 days later, they should be negative. If we're talking about methamphetamines, heroin, opiates of any kind, cocaine, etc., it should be negative. If it's not negative, that's a huge red flag that would indicate continued use. I know that a lot of times when I'm staffing these cases with my CPS staff, they will say, well, Marco, I sent this mom for a UA on June 1st, and she was positive at greater than 20,000. It peaked out, and so that was the level. And now on June 7th or June 8th, she's still positive, but she's quote unquote only positive for 1,020. Could it be that she's still positive because her first test was so high, the level was greater than 20,000? And the answer to that is simply no. That's continued use. So don't let those levels fool you. And I'll kind of explain a little bit more about levels in a minute. But I really encourage my staff, and I would encourage you guys in CASA as well, get in the habit of treating these tests simply as positive or negative. Don't fall victim to looking at levels too much and thinking, well, this is a low level, or this is a high level, and this is a medium level. I hate the use of that language. And the reason that I hate the use of that language is because it really communicates inaccurate information to whoever it is that you're speaking to. So if you're speaking to the court, you're really communicating this very subjective value, like, well, who gets to decide what's a low level and what's a high level? If you're speaking to a family, it becomes even more problematic, right? Because if you say, well, this is a low level, it's almost as you're okaying a certain amount of use. So like when I have a caseworker and they'll call me and say, well, Marco, I sent mom and dad for a UA. Dad is positive at greater than 20,000, so I'm really worried about him. I need to get him into treatment. Mom is quote unquote only positive for 1,500, so I'm not really worried about her. Well, I want to help my staff, and I obviously do help my staff, but I always tell my staff when they present a question like that to me, I always have to kind of pump the brakes and say, okay, well, we need to kind of do a little mini training here because you're not understanding what you're looking at. If you're telling me that you're concerned about dad only because of this number and you're not concerned about mom because of her number, then you're not understanding these drug tests. The bottom line is, within the last 3 to 5 days, both of these individuals have used the drug. For you to say, I'm not concerned about this person because their level is quote unquote only 1,500, then you're basically, what you've just communicated to that family is, I'm okay with a little bit of cocaine use. I'm just not okay with a lot of cocaine use. And that's not a stance that we're ever going to take as an agency. So I always share that with staff. And again, I will share that with you guys. I know that sometimes parents, attorneys are really big on cornering you out in the hallway before a hearing and saying like, hey, but my client is only at one, like the other client is the problem. My client is only at this. That's a positive is a positive. And either we're concerned or we're not concerned. It really is that simple. The last thing I'll say about UAs is that they are a 12-panel drug test. So they are by far our most comprehensive drug test. So not only do they catch kind of immediate use, but they're also a great tool for these situations where we feel like the individual is using something, but we don't know exactly what they're using. The UA is the tool to go because it captures the same 6 things that are captured in an oral swab. But in addition to that, it has a it has a methadone panel. It has a benzodiazepine panel. It captures barbiturates. It has a Quaalude panel, Rohypnol panel. It's just a way more comprehensive drug test. So if you think about it, it's casting a wider net. So it has the greater chance of catching any of these substances that may be abused that would otherwise not be detected in an oral swab, or they're also not going to be detected in a hair strand. And I'll explain that in a second. The last thing on this slide is they're all independently verified by a medical review officer. So if you have an opportunity to see a drug test, you'll notice at the bottom of the drug test, there's a signature. That signature is the medical review officer. That is the medical doctor that is independently verified that sample is in fact positive, and they've signed off on it. And so this idea sometimes that you hear people saying, well, what is it, a false positive? I would argue that no, that's not a false positive because this drug test has been tested twice. It's gone through the screening test. It met the requirement that it was positive during the screening test. So it went through further secondary confirmation testing. It was still positive in secondary confirmation test. And as a result, the medical review officer signed off on it. And so when you see the level, like whether it's 8,243 or whatever that random number might be, that's simply an indication of how much of that particular metabolite was present at the time that medical review officer signed off on it. That's really all that means. So the doctor's saying it's positive, and it's positive because this is the exact value that I saw when I did my verification. The last test that we have is hair strand testing. Hair strand testing is really intended to capture long-term use, historical use. It's It's a 6-panel drug test, so it's exactly like a swab in terms of what it captures. It captures marijuana, cocaine, opiates, methamphetamines, amphetamines, and PCP. So it doesn't capture as much as a UA does. So sometimes you may see cases where a caseworker will send a parent for a UA and a hair strand test, and the parent's UA may be positive, but the hair strand is negative, for example. And then there's this huge confusion as to, well, why is the UA positive and the hair strand is negative? It's not an apples to apples comparison. If the parent, for example, is abusing Xanax, which is a benzodiazepine, Xanax is only captured in a UA. So it would only appear in a UA. You will never see it in a hair strand because that's not one of the things that hair strand is detecting. So you just have to make sure that you're comparing apples to apples in a situation like that. Sometimes we have cases where a parent is positive for marijuana in a UA, but negative on a hair strand for marijuana. Both tests detect marijuana. So what's the difference there? The reason for that is because marijuana is predominantly actually through feces. About 60% of all THC is released or excreted through feces. About 30% is excreted in urine, and 30 to 35%, and then the last 5 to 10% is excreted in hair and sweat. So very little THC is actually detected in hair. Generally, kind of as a rule of thumb, when you see marijuana in a hair strand test, that's generally indicative of previous heavy marijuana use, because that's not normally where marijuana is released. It's far more common to see marijuana in urine than it is in hair. With all the other substances, it's pretty straightforward. You'll see them in both. Like I say, it captures historical use. It takes about 10 days for hair to actually grow through your scalp. So as an example, if we were to receive a report that somebody was using a drug yesterday, so today is, what is today, June 9th? If we were to have received an intake yesterday and saying that on June 8th, a parent was using a drug, it would not make any sense to do a hair strand test today to try to capture yesterday's use. That use will not have grown through the scalp yet. We would want to do a urinalysis or oral swab to detect that use from yesterday. That's not to say that there's not any value doing a hair strand, but you're not going to capture yesterday's use on that hair strand. So you would want to do a UA to confirm yesterday's use, and you may choose to do a hair strand to capture historical use in addition to yesterday's use. If you were trying to show a pattern that not only is this person recently using, but maybe that they've been unsafe for the last 30, 60, 90 days, whatever it may be. If you needed that information, then that would be the purpose of doing a hair strand test. So hair strands capture about 90 days of drug use, but it takes about 10 days for hair to grow through the scalp. So what you're looking at is use from about 10 days ago to use about 100 days ago. That's your 90-day window of detection. It's not from yesterday to 90 days back. It's from about 10 days ago to 100 days ago. So if you were to do a hair strand test today, it would be going, May 29th through February 29th. That would be your or February 28th. That would be your window of detection. The exceptions to that is African American hair grows slightly slower. So instead of 90 days, it's closer to 120 days. It's closer to 4 months. So again, I always tell staff that if we're working with African American clients, you really want to do hair strand tests. You really want to wait about 4 months between hair strand tests. If you're working with Hispanic or Caucasian clients, you want to do every 100 days. So just a little bit over 3 months. I always give that kind of, I encourage staff to not do them exactly every 90 days. I always encourage staff to add 10 days and do them every 100 days, just to avoid any overlap. Because we really want to ensure that we don't create a situation where we create some kind of crazy legal argument where a parent's attorney is saying, well, you can't prove that this wasn't used that was already detected in the first test. And so you want to space them out enough that there's no overlap. That's why I also am highly, highly, highly encouraged that we don't use hair strand testing like on a monthly basis. I know that some judges and some courts are real big fans of like, I want to do a hair strand every month. I am really opposed to that because it gets super confusing. If you do a hair strand test and let's say the parent last used middle of May 15th, and we do a hair strand test in June, well, that June test is going to capture May 15th use, obviously. And then if we do we go back to court in July and we do another hair strand test, that's still going to capture May's use. Then if we do another test in August, that's still going to capture May's use. So again, we can get into this really problematic situation of if we're using this monthly hair strand as a basis for expanding visitation or considering lifting, supervision requirements, or we're basing that on when we're going to do a return home, or whatever stipulation we're using that hair strand, but we're doing them every month. One, it's a waste of money, which I know you guys don't care about, but our agency isn't like we don't have unlimited funds. I mean, they're $100 a pop, so we're going to have basically spent $200, just tossed it out the window because we're just duplicating things that we already knew. So I would argue that $200 was better spent paying their electric bill or doing, paying for daycare or something that was more meaningful for the family. But not only that, more important for you guys is we're creating a very confusing situation because we're just re-reporting use that we had already identified. So again, I would encourage the use of spacing it out 120 days for Caucasians and Hispanics, 120 to 130 days for African Americans. Obviously, if we're court ordered to do a shorter time frame, then we have to comply with a court order. But short of that, there really isn't any need to do them sooner than that. In the interim, in the in-betweens, I would maybe go with more frequent UAs. We can do UAs every week if we need to, multiple times a week if we need to. But it would be more cost effective and it would be more real time, which is also a much more benefit. The other thing that I need to point out, so everything that I've just said about hair strand testing, I'm talking specifically about head hair, meaning hair that grows on your head. That's head hair. If we are working with a client and the hair strand was collected from anywhere other than the head, and you guys are all adults here, so you can use your imaginations to figure out where I'm speaking about. Anywhere that is not your head, that's body hair. Body hair does not grow at the same rate as head hair does. The reason we say head hair, the reason we say a hair strand test detects about 90 days of drug use is because on average, hair grows at a rate of about a ½ inch a month. So regardless of how long your hair is, they cut it as close to the scalp as possible. They measure the 1.5 inches closest to the head, and that's what gets tested. If you have really long hair, everything after that first 1.5 inches gets discarded. They don't test 5-6 inches of hair. They only test the 1.5 inches closest to the head, and that equates to about 90 days. African American equates to about 120 days. If we're talking about arm hair, underarm hair, leg hair, chest hair, anywhere else, thankfully that hair does not grow at a rate of a ½ inch a month, or we would all look like, Chewbacca or something. We all know that body hair kind of grows pretty quickly. You start to get stubble on your arms or legs or wherever you shave, within the week. And, within 2 weeks, you've got that first 1/4 inch of hair. And then depending on race and ethnicity and that kind of thing, it kind of peaks at about a ½ inch or slightly over a ½ inch. And then it just kind of stays there and it hovers there. The exception being men's facial hair. A beard will grow longer than that. But hair everywhere else will kind of hover at that kind of roughly half-inch mark. So with body hair can detect use for a year. So it is not an ideal drug test for our cases, because if we say, for example, let's say we have a client and they say, quote unquote, I'm not going to lie to you, I went to Vegas New Year's Eve last year and I know it was dumb, but I went and did some cocaine with my buddies. My kids were with my parents back in Texas. I was in Vegas, you know, whatever. If that's all the evidence we have, we don't have any way to dispute that. I mean, a body hair test would in fact go back to New Year's Eve last year. So we can disagree with their decision. I mean, obviously, I think we would all agree that going to Vegas and doing some cocaine with your friends is probably not a wise decision. But if we can verify that the kids were with grandparents back in Texas, that's not really a child safety issue. Now, that's, again, I don't want to confuse that. I'm not saying that that's okay. But remember, we're addressing child safety issues. We're not a law enforcement agency, so we're not concerned with whether this individual broke the law or, you know, whatever. That's not our purview. Our purview is, did it impact child safety? And so that's why I'm not a huge fan of body hair, because it's such a huge window of time frame. And thankfully, we don't have to do body hair very often. The exception to that is, like, you know, sometimes men with really short haircuts, we may have to do chest hair or underarm hair or something like that. Just be aware that it goes back up to a year. So it's not ideal. We need to supplement that hair test with some UAs or something that narrows down that time frame. The other thing is, kind of once you do a body hair test, you've kind of locked yourself out of being able to monitor that for basically a year. So if you're going to have to do a body hair test, you really better do it at the absolute beginning of the case, the moment that case becomes legal. There's no point in waiting until you're 3, 4, 5 months into this case when you have a 12-month legal deadline, because you're basically, if you do it at the first permanency hearing at 3 months into the case, you're not going to be able to do another body hair test to compare it with. So if you've determined that, hey, this guy keeps his head shaved, that's his normal hairstyle, he's not trying to deceive us, that's just, maybe he's going bald, or maybe that's just his hairstyle. And it doesn't seem logical to ask him to wait 3 months for his hair to grow. You're wanting an answer right now. Again, you better ask for it at the front end, so that you at least allow enough time for the possibility, if worse comes to worse, to give yourself enough time to request one at the absolute end of the case. So hopefully that makes sense. Some specialty tests that we have available to us. We have the ability to test for alcohol. That's Etg Testing Alcohol is an 80-hour test, so it's a little bit over 3 days, 3 days and 8 hours to be exact. Alcohol can be very difficult. You know, when I was in the field, when I was a caseworker, alcohol cases and prescription medication cases were my absolute two worst type of cases to get as a caseworker, because, you know, alcohol is legal and prescription drugs, parents may have a valid prescription for it. So it requires a lot more work to try to get to the bottom of the situation to determine if it's misuse, abuse, appropriate use, etc. And they're very difficult. With alcohol cases, I always encourage my staff to, at the beginning of the case, get a safety plan agreed on, where a client says, even though it's legal for me, I'm of legal drinking age, I'm going to voluntarily agree to cease alcohol consumption for the next 30 days, or, you know, whatever they want to agree to. If you have that, then we can do random UAs for alcohol, and then we don't have to worry about, well, whether it's legal or not. This person basically agreed to discontinue alcohol use, and then if they have a positive, basically they're demonstrating to you that they have an inability to cease alcohol use for a very limited window of time. We're not asking them to never have a drink again. We're saying, you know, can you discontinue use for 30 days while we have this open case? If they can't do that, then that might point to a problem. Bath salts, we don't see too many bath salt cases anymore, thankfully. But we do have the ability to test for that. That's a standalone test. K2 is a standalone test. We have the ability to test for D and L isomer confirmation testing. That's only for methamphetamine positives. You know, sometimes we get these parents on a meth case who will say, I don't use meth. This is because of fill in the blank, whatever over-the-counter medication you want to say they're taking. And it's my Adderall, or it's this, or it's that, and they have this excuse. So in those situations, the caseworker simply staffs with their supervisor and gets approval for a DL isomer confirmation test. It's a secondary test. It's more expensive. You guys don't need to worry about the cost. We'll definitely approve it if that's an issue that we need to address. The good thing about DL confirmation testing is that the client does not have to go back to the lab and submit another sample. The labs keep all positive samples for a year. They keep them on file. So if we request a DL isomer confirmation test, we simply send the payment authorization to the lab. The lab will pull that positive sample out of their storage and retest it for D and L confirmation. So D isomers and L isomers are stereoisomers. And the easiest way to think about that is think about your right and left hands. Your right and left hands, you know, assuming you haven't lost a finger in you know, high school shop class or something, they should look exactly the same, but they're mirror opposites. You know, they're the same, but if you put them on top of each other, your thumbs and all your fingers are in opposite directions. That's how these isomers look. So the D stands for some very long technical scientific name. The L stands for some equally long technical scientific name. The easiest way I've figured out to explain this to my staff is think of D as for drug, L is for legal. So if you habitually snort a Vicks inhaler, you know, those little white inhalers that you see like during allergy season or flu season, you can theoretically potentially test positive for methamphetamine, for the L version of methamphetamine, because the menthol in there is L-methamphetamine. So in theory, you could test positive for methamphetamine. I say in theory in quotes because I've never actually seen it on a lab confirmed test, but in theory, it's possible. D methamphetamine is the illicit drug, the street drug methamphetamine. So again, if you have a client who is disputing the validity of our methamphetamine positive, we can request a DL isomer test. The lab will send it back to us. It won't be labeled as positive or negative. It'll be a percentage. How much percent of D isomer versus L isomer. Anything over 20% D isomer is the illicit street drug methamphetamine. So again, we'll get them back and they'll say like 91% D isomer, et cetera, et cetera. We've done probably close to 500 of these tests since we've had this thing available to us. And I have yet to see any person test positive for L-methamphetamine. So I would just throw that out there, guys. Don't hold your breath that you're going to have a client that's actually positive for having abused a Vicks inhaler. I mean, it could happen, but I've yet to see it happen. Then what else? We won't get into that. So I know I'm running out of time here. So the last thing that I'll leave you with is just before I take questions, is the meconium testing. Like I mentioned at the beginning, meconium, we don't have anything to do with that. That's something that's done at the hospital. They collect the first stool sample that the baby passes. Meconium begins to form in utero at about 12 to 14 weeks of gestation. So it has the ability to capture any prenatal drug use by the mom starting at around the end of the first trimester. So starting at about week 12 to week 14, somewhere in that range, all the way up to delivery, that's what it's capturing. So sometimes you guys will see a You might see an affidavit where we had mom was negative at delivery, the baby was negative at delivery, but then the hospital reported a positive meconium. And, you know, there's this dispute. Well, why did that mom have a negative UA and baby had a negative UA, but the meconium was positive? Again, it's not an apples to apples comparison. The meconium is showing you use during pregnancy starting at week 12, whereas the UA is only going back 3 to 5 days, unless we're talking about marijuana, then about 30 days. So it's not unusual for mom to possibly have a negative UA because, you know, she ceased use that last week because she didn't want to be positive at delivery, but there was nothing she could do to flush out the use that she had during her pregnancy, because that was now embedded in that meconium. So you may see that from time to time. Again, so when you see this and you're asking like, well, why is this one positive? Why is this one negative? Just got to remember that if the time frames are different, you're looking at different things. So with that, I mean, I think that covers drug testing in a very basic, you know, high level overview. I'm happy to answer whatever questions you guys may have.
Marco, that's awesome. Very informative. I'm getting all kinds of texts from people, so very helpful and very informative. As people are putting their questions in the text box, or the chat box, I have a question for you myself. Okay. What about nail bed testing?
Thank you for asking. So nail testing is, if there is such a thing as a happy medium between hair strand test and body hair testing, it would be nail testing. Nail testing goes back about 6 months. So if you have a client who their hair is too short to do a head hair test, but a body hair test, obviously going back a year, is kind of useless information. Let's say the case has been open for 6.5 months, and you're trying to determine if they've been sober since we've opened up our case. That nail test would be the kind of the happy compromise there.
Okay. So it's a little bit longer than, not as long as the 1 year, but it goes longer than the UA.
Longer than a head hair. So head hair is 3 months, nail testing is 6 months, body hair is 1 year.
Great. All right, we see that some here, so.
Yeah, and we don't, as an agency, we don't have a contract actually for nail testing, so we only have the ability to do nail testing like when it's, like if the judge orders it, the caseworker takes that court order and sends it to contracts, and then they do a one-off contract.
Okay.
To get that handled.
That explains why we don't see it as often as we do.
Yeah. We just don't have a contract for it.
Okay. So the questions in the text box, the first one is, can you share about how an infant might absorb meth or cocaine when the mother is testing negative, but the father is positive?
Sure. So what we see sometimes is, so children can test, well, and I say children, anybody can test positive for exposure, not just consumption. Okay. So there's 3 drugs that are likely to give you an exposure positive. I would label them in order of likelihood. Methamphetamine is the drug that would most likely be positive for exposure versus consumption. Then cocaine I would put next, specifically if we're talking about crack cocaine, smoked cocaine. And then third, and I would put kind of a big asterisk by this one, I would say is marijuana. And the reason I would put an asterisk by it is because with marijuana use, for you to test positive for exposure, it doesn't have to be malicious necessarily, but it has to be much more intentional. And what I mean by that is you have to be smoking in a really confined space. Like think of hotboxing, think of somebody smoking in like a bathroom with the door closed and no ventilation, or a car with the windows rolled up, some very confined space. And so we often see that with like particularly young parents who, mom and dad or like teen or parents in their early 20s, and they're driving around in their car with the windows rolled up. getting high off this, but they've got their baby in the back seat, and they're just unaware that the same thing that's causing them to be high in the front seat is affecting their child in the back seat. So sometimes we'll see a baby be positive for marijuana like that. But back to the original question, how can a baby be positive for methamphetamine or cocaine? Mom is negative, but dad is positive. If dad is using methamphetamine or smoking crack cocaine outside of the home, but then coming back and immediately picking up the baby or hugging the baby or whatever, all of that stuff can pass transdermally through his skin pores, through his sweat, through the clothes. If you know, methamphetamine in particular leaves behind a really sticky residue that gets all over everything. If dad is smoking, for example, in his vehicle, and then he loads up the kids in the car to take them to McDonald's or something. So a lot of times, I think sometimes we really villainize drugs and certainly understandably so. But I just want to remind folks that like people aren't trying to harm their kids. You know, so like you can love your children and have a substance use disorder. You know, those two things are not, they're not mutually exclusive. You can absolutely love your kids to death and still suffer from an addiction. And so you may have one parent who is, you know, in the example you're giving me, you know, they may think that dad may think he's being very protective, right? He's using outside the home. He's away from the kids. Like his wife doesn't even see him use, right? So he's using, let's say, in his car. That sounds protective on the surface when you stop and think about it, what if they're a one-car family? Now, every time they get in the car, they're getting back into this car that's hyper-contaminated. Or even if they're a two-car family, if they have a limited income, they're going to jump into whatever car actually has gas in it, right? So, or if let's say the situation is reversed, and let's say mom is using and dad is not, but, you know, and we're worried, well, where's this positive coming from? Well, mom may also think that she's being protective. She may be using in the bathroom behind closed doors. She's away from the kids. She's like, nobody knows that I'm using away from the, and now, again, on the surface, that sounds like protective, you know, like it's kind of a silver lining, you know, not that we agree with her use, but she's made the good decision to not use in front of her kids. I get that, but the problem with that is she's using it in the bathroom, right? So that's literally the one room in the house everybody has to use. So now everybody who goes in the bathroom has a likelihood of using drugs. So that's why we see some of those weird things. That's also why in cases where there's multiple kids in the home, you may see that the infant or the really young kids are positive, but the older kids aren't positive. That's simply a matter of amount of exposure, right? A teenager who knows that their parents are using, even though they may not acknowledge, they may not tell you that they know that their parents are using, they're aware of what's going on. I can tell you myself, I knew at an early age that what was happening in my house wasn't correct. And so you learn to just remove yourself from that environment. You learn to go hang out at your friend's house. Whereas an infant doesn't have that opportunity. You know, they're relying on their parent 24/7 for care. So they're just in the environment more.
So it could even happen during a visit too. If a parent comes in for a visit and they're hugging and kissing on their kids.
Right, it could. You know, I always encourage staff, if we have a concern of a parent who is, particularly with methamphetamine, I would say more than anything, to methamphetamine and crack cocaine, and you know, those smoked drugs with those toxins. I am not a fan of requiring a negative test before doing a visit because it doesn't really speak to what's happening right then. A UA goes back 3 to 5 days. It takes you a couple of days to get the results. And so, you know, so now we're 7 days removed from the use. And so you get a drug test back and it's positive and you say, well, now you can't have a visit. Well, that's not speaking to what's happening right at the moment. That's telling you that a week ago, this parent was using. So I'm not a fan of that. But what I am a fan of is if we know that we have someone with substance use disorder and they're using methamphetamine and they just have not demonstrated an they have not demonstrated an ability to produce consistent negatives, I don't think it's unreasonable to ask that parent to bring a change of clothes and to require that they go in and wash their hands thoroughly and put on fresh clothes before they come to visit. And the reality is that may become the new norm anyway because of COVID-19. It may, particularly these, parents who are maybe coming from work where they may have been using with other people. I would definitely encourage, mom or dad to change shirts or whatever, because that methamphetamine, that residue is on your clothing. And so if you take an infant, a baby, and then you're swaddling them on your shoulder and you're rocking them and you're trying to get them to calm down, they're literally laying on that residue. And so it's an easy fix. Just change your shirt. I'm not saying not have a visit. I'm saying wash your hands, change your shirt,
Okay. All right. Then the next question is similar to that. It says how children can test positive for meth when only limited contact with the parents, but they're not living with them. So it could be that contact exposure.
It could be that contact exposure. And again, you also have to consider that when we're talking about a kid testing positive, it's a hair strand, so it's going back 3 months. So even if they've had limited exposure, unless we're talking about a case 6 months into the case, then that would be weird. But if we're talking 2 or 3 months into the case, and we're saying, well, yeah, but the kids were removed 2 months ago, yeah, but the hair strand goes back 3 months ago. So
okay,
keep in mind the time frames.
Then they had the question about you test positive at removal. Are the children tested more often as a follow-up?
So that's a great question. There is no protocol that requires any specific frequency of testing. The guidelines is if they test positive at removal, we need to notify the child's primary care physician, because the idea behind testing a child isn't to somehow put a termination ground in our back pocket, or to make a removal easier, or to make it easier to terminate parental rights later on in the case. That's not the reason behind drug testing. The reason behind drug testing a child is to determine if that level of severity of exposure actually occurred. So if it did, that it can be addressed medically, and so that it can be monitored. And if the kids need to be referred to ECI to make sure that they're hitting developmental milestones, that kind of stuff. So it's from a medical standpoint. So okay. We have that initial testing, and then we kind of defer to medical professionals.
So we shouldn't look at it as an opportunity to confirm what might be happening with the parents. It's a medical concern that we need to be.
Yeah, we approach it. Well, I can't speak. There's 10,000 caseworkers, so I can't speak for everybody. But from a state office perspective, our guidance is we are trying to make sure that there aren't any the exposure hasn't caused any medical issues that need to be addressed.
Okay, good. All right, and then the next question is, can CBD oil show up in a drug screen?
My favorite question.
Yep. You froze.
Is it possible? Yes. Is that plausible? No. There is so little THC in CBD oil. CBD oil, for it to be legal, can contain no more than 0.3% THC, which is a negligible amount. Okay. And there's studies that I can share with you guys if you want to dive into this further. But there's studies that have shown that someone taking 3 times the maximum allowable daily dosage of a CBD product containing the maximum amount of 0.3% CBD oil over a course of 2 weeks. So taking 3 times the maximum amount every day for 2 weeks still couldn't produce enough to cause a positive on a lab confirmed drug test. Eventually, theoretically 0.3 plus 0.3 plus 0.3 eventually will get you to a positive. How much would that take? More than 3 times over more than 2 weeks, So if they're having a positive, I would say it's not from CBD oil. if they're adamant that it is from CBD oil, I think we need to be having some conversations about what exactly are they trying to treat with this CBD oil that they're taking such enormous amounts of it, because it obviously has to be more than 3 times the maximum amount.
Very good to know, because that is something we're going to see more and more now, I guess.
No, I answer that exact question 3 times a day.
Okay, so then the next question was, where can we find reliable information regarding long-term effects on children who have been exposed to meth? Is there somewhere you would point us on that?
Sure. You guys are always free to email me, and I'll share studies that I have.
Okay.
So you can certainly use me as a resource. SAMHSA has, SAMHSA has some good resources on that. Children and Family Futures has a lot of really good resources on that.
All right. I'll email you then, and you can send me.
Yeah, I can send you some links.
Okay, great. Then the next one is, if urine is negative for meth, but the hair was positive over 30,000, which is the level, and I know we can't be too concerned about the number. Does this mean that they still use meth within the last 3 months, or were exposed to meth within the last 3 months? No, wait, that didn't say for a child. Okay, never mind. So if urine is negative for meth, they haven't used it recently, but hair is positive, that means they have used it within 3 months.
Yes. Yeah, again, you have to keep in mind, a urine test simply means that no use in the last 3 to 5 days.
But
but a positive hair strand test, I mean, they could have used 7 days ago. They could have used 15 days ago, 20 days, a month ago, 2 months ago. You know, I don't know when they use, but if you have a positive at 30,000 or whatever it may be, that certainly speaks to some use within the last 3 months.
Okay.
Just not within the last 3 to 5 days.
Great. Okay, guys, that's all the questions in the chat box. If you have a question that you would like to ask Marco before we go, feel free to unmute real quick and you can ask your question, or you can throw it in the chat. Anybody at all? So Marco, we really appreciate it. You're seeing in there everyone, this is probably one of the most thorough and informative trainings on drug use and numbers and testing that we have ever had. I mean, it's really great, and we so appreciate it, and we'll probably be contacting you for follow-up. So
absolutely. I would love to go out there at some point once we all get out of jail free cards.
Yes.
So at some point in the future, I would like to go actually see you guys in person.
Absolutely. Yeah, and we can go in more depth and even branch it out a little bit.
There's so many things that we can talk about. Like I said, I just try to give you kind of a big picture so that you guys know when you're going into court and you hear a caseworker asking for this versus that, you kind of have some idea of the rationale behind it. Or now you may be more knowledgeable than some new caseworker. So if they're asking for something and you're like, well, that's really not speaking to what I'm interested in what happened last week.
Yes.
I don't need a body hair test that goes back a year. I want, so I'm not interested in the body hair test. I need this client to do a UA, then you guys can advocate for what you guys are wanting.
Oh, it's absolutely helpful and so informative. And we definitely will have you back, and we will have you in person as soon as we can. So guys, if you haven't already, send Marco a thank you in the group chat there. Give him a thumbs up. And Marco, we appreciate you very much. Oh, before we go, I need to have you draw a couple of numbers for me. So between 1 and 29, will you pick out a number?
9.
Number 9. Miss Wendy, you win a door prize. You get one of our mugs. And Marco, we'll have one of these for you when you come as well. They're cute. And would you pick another one?
17.
17. Miss Christy McNoll, you get the little charger. So you charge it up when you're going to be out on a visit. You can charge your phone with it. It's a little bracelet charger. So that's Christy. And so then we have one more.
4.
There we go. Anita Broxson, you get this little Texas Casa bag. So all of these are going to be waiting up here at the office for you guys. And that's our door prizes for the day. And we appreciate you guys very much. You'll get credit for today. And we're going to give you 1.25 hours for today. So good job. Thank you for joining us. And Marco, thank you again.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure. Thank you, guys.
All right. Thank you all. See you later. And Marco, I'll be in contact.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am.
Bye-bye.
Bye.